Welcome back to the Shepherd's Pie, a slice of faith for our messy lives. I'm Tony Kolenc, a professor at Ave Maria School of Law, the father of 5 grown children, and the author of inspirational fiction for teens and adults. Super excited that final chapter of my Harwood Mysteries, The Devil's Ransom by Loyola Press, and Incarnate from Chrism Press. Lots going on there. You can check it all out on my website. But today I'll be speaking with Jean P. Kelly about ways to access spiritual wisdom even during times of painful relationships. My guest today is Jean P. Kelly, the author of Less Helping Them, More Healing You. She is a PhD, a storyteller, spiritual guide, and the host of the award-winning podcast Read, Pray, Write. She's also an associate professor of journalism at Otterbein University in Central Ohio. She teaches writing, branding, graphic design, and podcast storytelling. Welcome, Jean, to the show.
Thank you, Tony. It's such an honor to be here and talk to you more about my book.
Let's kind of set the stage a little bit for who you are, how you got to a place in your life where you are even writing a book of this type. Maybe just give us a little background.
Sure. Well, given my profession, I've always been a writer. The discovery of what I call in the book spiritual reading, which is Lectio Divina, was really for me a Holy Spirit moment in my life. And that's why I now feel called to my podcast is about that. And it's also the structure behind my book, a spiritual memoir. So it does tell my story. I've done journalistic research on patterns of unbalanced relationships because I was in the midst of one. And then I show how spiritual reading gave me the strength to realize my situation. When in my 20s, I fell in love with and made a family with an unrepentant alcoholic. But I, in this process, realized there was much more that I had learned in my family of origin about what charity was and what my role was as a good Catholic, to always be a helper. It was a very unrealistic and incorrect interpretation of charity, honestly. I just got to a point where when I went to a retreat at my parish, where this was spiritual reading was being taught and given somebody who's a writer, being a writer and a reader, I'm like, oh, reading is prayer. I can do that, and because I was in a really kind of desperate situation, felt very alone. The problem with trying to help somebody who doesn't want to be helped is that you can never do enough. You lose complete sight of your own needs. And I had really deep spiritual needs. And that's what this practice helped me realize and really be nourished by it. And so that's part of the reason I wanted to bring that to others.
Wow. All right. So there's a lot there for us to, I think, unpack over this next little bit. First, let's start with the difficult relationships part, because you were already sharing. I appreciate your candor in sharing about that. A lot of people, I think, get involved, maybe not knowingly at first,
right.
In difficult relationships. So maybe can you talk to that for a few minutes? What are we talking about when we say difficult relationships, and how do we find ourselves getting into these relationships?
I think sometimes we don't have the self-knowledge that we need and the self-acceptance to recognize what we're expecting from relationships. I realized, retrospectively only, that my need to help was a way of getting other people to love me. It's what really is false humility. It is giving to get. But again, I didn't realize that, right? And I realized that if I was being kind and charitable, I would get that back. But that doesn't always happen. There's so many different issues that people have in their background and childhood trauma, mental illness, things like that. We meet all sorts of different people in our lives. But if our first impulse is to help them, even if they haven't asked us to help them, that can really put us in a dangerous situation. And being a helper there's nothing wrong with that. Charity is what we are taught, but it's when you are doing it to that extreme and when you're deriving your self-value from it. And I think that had a lot to do with why, and it wasn't just in marriage, but I talk about in the book, other relationships and the importance of I learned about establishing boundaries with other family members who were addicted. Very often in families where you don't recognize that being a helper, which is psychologists, psychiatrists call that being codependent, that you're going to be inclined to do that. You don't realize it. It's codependency is one of those, it's a fraught term. People don't like to talk about it. They don't recognize it in themselves. And it's because denial is such a good coping strategy. It really works. So you push all that down. And that's what spiritual reading let me mine that out of myself.
We are taught, especially as, Christians, to help others, to be charitable to others. When does somebody know that they've gone from just being a charitable helper to getting into one of those types of relationships? And why do they even call it codependency, by the way?
Right. That's why the term's actually really disputed. That's why some people prefer calling them enmeshed or unbalanced. It's when you're always the giver and that other person it's not a balanced relationship. I think we often feel it's hard for us to not help because we feel like we're not caring enough, but there's so many ways to care for somebody. And one of those ways is to recognize and respect their own autonomy, that they are going to be, if they're adults, making choices for themselves, and that we cannot help them with everything, especially when they don't even ask us. Very often they're not asking us to help them. If you can get that perspective, and it's very, very difficult to have that perspective because these tend to be your closest relationships, your most loving, with parent to child or spouse. And it's very hard to kind of assert yourself once you've had these patterns, right? So what I like to talk about what I discovered is that the 4 steps of spiritual reading, I say, gave me the pace. They let me slow down my life, because when you're the fixer and you're always the responsible one, you're like on that gerbil wheel and you think the more I do, the more people will love me. It also gave me the space to grow my own intellectual life, my own spiritual life, and start seeing things from a different perspective. And then, of course, the grace, or all the gifts of spiritual reading, which is to learn how to cultivate an openness. And that requires detachment. And that is the hardest thing for somebody to do who's a helper, which is to say, you know what? I'm going to let this happen without my direct intervention.
All right, so let's pivot a little to this idea of spiritual reading. Some people I've heard use the term Lectio Divina, which sounds fancy. And it may not be apparent to us how this practice could relate to this difficult relationship issue you've been talking about. But let's just kind of set the stage on what are we talking about when we say Lectio Divina, spiritual reading, what kinds of things are we reading, all that kind of stuff.
Both on my podcast and in this book, it's a spiritual memoir. So I tell the story using 8 steps. So Lectio Divina, usually sometimes you see 5, but I broke them down into smaller steps. But the big 4 steps are read, reflect, respond, receive. And so that kind of structure was what really helped me in the midst of that anxiety that happens in those relationships. And the text I would read with intention. That's really the idea. It's part of my prayer time in the morning. I will, maybe say morning offering, do other prayers, maybe rosary. But then I let the Holy Spirit guide me into what I should read more carefully and read with intention. And so in the book, I've gotten used to, or since I've been doing the practice regularly for a long time, know how to sense a quickening, something that catches my consciousness in a different way, makes me pause and go, that's interesting. And then I know to go back to that. And so it can be music lyrics. It can be a poem that I have heard the poet's conversion story. And then I look, get a book of poetry for this person and kind of thumb through it and go, whoa, here's a connection I see. And then I know to go back to that and pick a very small text. It's just a couple sentences or 2 and mull it over time, take real time with it. Half an hour, maybe total. I've done it enough that I can get it down to 20 minutes. So the first step is the reading it. then you read it again. This is the traditional practice, to read it a second time and really just kind of see the words that shimmer to you, but you try not to draw conclusions right away. That's for me, what really calmed my anxiety, how quickly I would always want to fix things and jump to conclusions. You can't do that in this practice. You just kind of have that openness, and just because you want to listen to the voice of God and what this has meaning in your life. So you don't want to jump in and solve it. I got it, God. I know what this is telling me. No, you can't. And then that third step, the response step, can be all sorts of things. And the reason I call my podcast Read, Pray, Write, for me as a writer, often I'll journal in some way. Sometimes maybe it's really something coherent, or sometimes it's word association, it's a list, it's nothing, it's just words. It's trying to record my response. And sometimes I even write a prayer in that moment for what I need at that moment. I really believe that the text I choose, sometimes randomly in that way, is what I need in that moment in time. And then the probably the best part of Lectio Divina, but possibly the hardest, is that what I call receiving step. And that is that quiet stillness and listening without doing anything. So,
And I'm going to ask you to expand on that in a little bit, but I'm interested in the texts that you're choosing, and how long are these texts? Like, do you put word counts on them? Like, maybe just talk a little bit to how you pick text, because when I've always heard this, it's always in the context of like you're reading something from scripture,
Right,
and maybe
right.
the daily reading or whatever. So maybe just talk about that a little bit.
Right. And again, because I believe the divine speaks to us in so many ways, what we're trying to do is to develop a attitude of openness and listening. So to be able to encounter a text, it's a broad definition of what a text is. There has been an ancient practice of visio divina. It might be something visual. It could be an artist's interpretation of scripture. There's an artist actually lives in my hometown who does modern day versions of the saints. She creates modern portraits of the saints, and they're like icons. So that's the tradition of praying with icons. And then sometimes even maybe if you have been spiritual journaling, you go back to something you wrote before and look at your own words, because your life can be a text. And I think because really for me, the goal of especially trying to use spiritual reading as a way to understand difficult relationships is you're trying to understand yourself and your background, your self-knowledge, and then accept yourself for who you are, divinely made. And then, only then, are you really mature enough and ready to give yourself to others. So the text can be pretty short. There are a couple of sentences, and usually I read if it's a book or a novel, a poem, I'll read the entire offering the first time through, but then I narrow in. And so maybe, the passage that really struck me in some way, made me catch my breath, made me kind of like, or just sometimes it can actually be a painful something that the text tells you, right? That stops you and goes, ooh, you'll know it. That's the thing. If you're trusting your heart and your soul and God's participation in this prayer life with you, that's why to me, it can be almost any text.
So you mentioned that the hardest step might be that last one where you have to receive and be silent. Any tips for people who, we can all read and reflect, but that receiving in silence, any tips you've learned on how to do that successfully?
Well, I think with anything, the more you practice you get, the better you become. And it's making that decision to carve out the 20 minutes or half an hour for the spiritual reading practice on a regular basis. And then that way you get better at contemplative practice. I can tell you, I very rarely get into deep contemplative state. And that's okay. That's what I want people to know, is that forgive yourself for that. It'll come, but it's not your doing. That's the whole message of spiritual reading, Lectio Divina. You can't make it happen. It is God's grace is given to you in that time. And all your job is to recognize it and to be a little more attuned to it. And then you'll learn it for the next time. You'll remember you were successful in a certain way. You'll see the benefits of a softened heart, because that's really the outcome. I realized that in this relationship, I was becoming as hardened as the people who were the difficult people. And this allowed me to step back a little bit and say, I will not let my heart harden. I will be open and available. And that's sometimes detachment that you have to cultivate.
So yeah, let's make the connection now between the spiritual practice, what you call the transcendent gift of an ancient spiritual practice, really just, this Lectio Divina idea. Can you share how this kind of, even in your life and your relationship, brought you to a place where you feel like this is something that could be beneficial to people with difficult relationships?
Well, I like to joke that I had no idea I needed this in my life. I thought I was doing a good job, keeping up the appearances, making everything work, right? Because I took all that responsibility on myself. So I like to say I wrote the book to help people who don't even know that they need help, who've not asked for help and don't realize they even, they don't need it. And so that's the very definition of extreme helping. I realize that. So that's my little disclaimer there. But I was just so grateful there was a structure to it. And when you are in a close relationship with an addicted person, you're always on alert for the next disaster. It's always going to come. And there's so much anxiety, even if you don't acknowledge it. And so this was simple, right? It was 4 steps. You can't really do it wrong. I have that on good authority. I'm a Benedictine oblate. So, it was the Saint Benedict who kind of formalized the process. And sometimes you can look, you can take days thinking about a text. I have a chapter in the book where for a full month, I was reading the story of a soul, Teresa Lisieux, and let that kind of soak into my being. And that just having that other thing that was inspiring me, affirming me for, who I was kind of an act of resistance in a way. So I was glad to carve that out for myself. So I think because it's pretty simple and, you can't do it wrong, even if you're in the midst of a really desolate time or, an anxious time or a painful time, it's available to give you those gifts.
And you had a really catchy trio of phrases, something about space and grace. Yeah. And it sounds like that really synthesized some of the lessons. Can you kind of bring us through those 3 things?
Right. So, especially in times of difficulty and anxiety, even when I wasn't expecting it, I just went to this retreat and then started trying it out. So it gave me a slower pace because, again, when you're in a relationship that's unbalanced, you tend to, if you're the person without the problem, whatever that is, you're tending to take all the responsibility for yourself. And so you're going a mile a minute. And this slowed me down. And that's the slower pace. And then it gave me that personal space. It was to recognize that I deserve this. I've heard a great expression of, or summary of our responsibility as Christian people, that we need to reach out to suffering and touch suffering with love. But it's very likely that suffering will overwhelm us, right? And come over on us. And we have a responsibility, equal responsibility, to pull back and regroup so we can love again. And so that was that space that allowed me to think through things and feel okay about that personal space. And I understand self-care and all that, and this is not a pedicure. Okay. This is really intellectual. If that's what you need, spiritual. Sometimes it's just that you don't even know what you've figured out. That's okay. The mystery of it can be something that is what you needed that day. So that space. And then the graces, I think, are really important, which is the self-knowledge, self-acceptance. They're actually kind of a trajectory. You have to know yourself. And so sometimes having this meditative time, you are asking yourself, why am I doing this? Why am I helping? What is it in my background that makes that such an extreme need? And then just get a little bit of it, and then you'll understand a little more, but you won't draw a lot of conclusions, because this is the other thing I love about it is a solitary pursuit. It is, you're carving out this time for you and God as part of your prayer to figure out. So if you learn who you are, and then you can accept who you are, because God made you the way you are, and you should not be, you tend to beat yourself up a lot when you're in a relationship because you're helping like this. Your relationship isn't helping. You're not being effective in helping, and so you're thinking you're less than somehow. This gave me that value, understood that maybe that was a disordered way of thinking about myself. That had long histories sometimes.
So if somebody's listening to the show and they're going, gee, I'm wondering if I'm in one of those relationships, hearing her talk, it's ringing some bells for me, but they're not really sure what to do, how to even diagnose it. Do you have any words of advice, just based on your own experience, even of how they can discover if they're in one of those relationships, and if they need this kind of spiritual solution to that?
I always disclaim the fact that even though I have a PhD after my name, I'm not a therapist. And I really, really believe in professional therapy. I think it's incredibly important as couples, as individuals, as whatever that relationship is, because that perspective is what you need toward that self-knowledge. So, and also spiritual direction. But again, that's maybe later on in the process. Even reading about it, sometimes you don't always see yourself, though, because know what denial is, know how effective denial is. You can read books about this and not see yourself. And that's why I like the practice, because it's that little voice that's in you. And through this spiritual reading, that voice gets a little louder, right? Because you're doing this once a week at first, maybe then every other day. And then you'll start to attend that voice a little bit that'll tell you what to do about it next. And everybody has different situations. I'm not about to, say that, there's one way to solve any of this. The journey is what matters. That if you can get that self-knowledge, that self-acceptance, then that'll guide you how to go about this. And everybody's situation is different. The timing's different. Took me a long time to realize that. And then if you need to make a change, you need great courage. And that's how I also felt supported by spiritual reading. I knew that God still loved me and I could do this hard thing, that I had to make a change. It's hard to maintain boundaries with people you love. But what you find out is, again, if you have this openness and this acceptance of yourself, what you realize when you establish a boundary and you keep it, because people will test your boundaries, difficult people will test it, and you will fall back in old patterns very easily. But then when the boundary works, oh my gosh, you realize, hey, the world did not come crashing down around our ears. This was okay. It was okay for me to assert my boundary with this person. And it could be a coworker. It could be anybody that says, okay, that went better. Might not have been what I did in the past, but I can see the benefits of trying something different.
All right. So much learned, experienced wisdom, it sounds like, in this. So your book, Less Helping Them, More Healing You. So if folks are interested in getting their hands on the book and getting access to your podcast or any of your other writings, learning about you, where would you want them to go? Okay.
My website is jeankelly.com, and all of it's there. The book was published by ACTA. It's on Amazon, and the podcast is readpraywrite.com.
Well, Jean, it has been really great having you on the show and thinking through some of these issues and this really sort of unorthodox, but yet totally orthodox way of really thinking about, how to help cope with these difficult relationships through spiritual reading. It's just been great. I really appreciate having you on the show.
I really appreciate your time, Tony, and access to your audience. I hope they found this helpful and inspirational.
Unfortunately, that is all the time we have for the show today. Again, we've been speaking with Jean P. Kelly about spiritual reading and how it can help us in the difficult relationships in our lives. Again, this is Antony Barone Kolenc. If you want to check out any of my writings, or if you want me to come talk to your middle school classroom or your homeschool group, just check out my website at antonykolenc.com. But until next time, may God bless us as we rely on our faith to work through the messy challenges of our lives.